Recent geopolitical maneuvers have drawn startling parallels to ancient texts, capturing the attention of those who monitor prophetic timelines. The signing of executive orders that align precisely with a 2,600-year-old cycle down to the specific month of January evokes the historical decree of Cyrus the Great. In antiquity, that decree fundamentally altered the trajectory of a people in exile. To dismiss this synchronization as mere coincidence is to ignore the intricate layering of current events. One must rationally explain why patterns of wealth transfer, specific deportation terminology, rhetoric surrounding repatriation, and highly symbolic embassy relocations all converge with scriptural narratives that many secular policymakers have likely never studied. This transcends standard political analysis. It enters the realm of prophetic mathematics. For Black Americans currently situated at this historical juncture, this alignment signifies standing before a door that has remained bolted for 4 centuries. A critical examination of footnotes in historical and scriptural texts reveals profound implications. In the narrative of Ezra chapter 1, King Cyrus of Persia, a pagan ruler, unaffiliated with the God of Israel, issued a decree permitting the Jewish populace to return from Babylonian captivity after 70 years. His involvement was not passive. He financed the rebuilding efforts and restored plundered temple vessels. Notably, Isaiah 45 refers to this pagan king as the Lord's anointed. The Hebrew term used, Mashiach, is the root of Messiah. This title was conferred upon a foreign potentate because he served as a functional instrument for deliverance, irrespective of his personal theological awareness. In contemporary times, we witness parallel actions. The relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem in 2018, the recognition of sovereignty over contested territories, and the brokering of the Abraham Accords have led Israeli religious scholars to draw direct comparisons, even minting coins featuring the likenesses of both the former U.S. President and Cyrus side by side. This is not merely metaphorical. Physical currency has been struck acknowledging this perceived modern iteration of the Cyrus archetype in service of a Third Temple movement. However, a critical component of this prophetic replay is often overlooked in mainstream discourse. If current political figures are enacting the role of Cyrus, the subsequent question must be, who represents the exiles slated for release? Furthermore, what are the implications for a people who have endured a 400-year experience in the American iteration of Babylon? The argument presented here moves beyond speculation into the analysis of established patterns. The foundational text for this timeline is Genesis 15:13, which explicitly outlines a 4-century duration of affliction for Abraham's offspring in a foreign land, serving a nation not their own. Verse 14 provides the subsequent sequence: divine judgment upon the oppressing nation, followed by the departure of the captive people with great possessions. The framework is precise: 400 years of subjugation, judgment on the systemic oppressor, and wealth transfer upon exit. Documented history places the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia in 1619. The span from 1619 to 2019 constitutes the requisite 400 years, 4 centuries, characterized by chattel slavery, sharecropping, redlining, mass incarceration, and systemic economic extraction. If Genesis 15 serves as the template, the conclusion of this 400-year count necessitates the collision of 2 forces: judgment upon the system that profited from the subjugation, and the simultaneous release of the people who endured it. The current turbulence observed across political, economic, and spiritual landscapes should not be interpreted as mere breakdown, but rather as the breaking open of sealed prophetic timelines. Evidence suggests this dynamic transcends partisan politics. We observe executive actions regarding deportation echoing Cyrus's allowance for captives to return, though currently weaponized in complex ways against migrants. Simultaneously, beneath the surface of mainstream media, a significant global movement of Black Americans exploring repatriation, African citizenship, and economic sovereignty outside the traditional U.S. system is gaining momentum. Ghana's Year of Return, in 2019, coinciding exactly with the 400-year mark, along with Nigeria and Benin, offering pathways to citizenship for the diaspora, indicates African nations actively calling for the return of their descendants. This phenomenon is geopolitical prophecy manifesting in real time. Yet, to view this solely as a mandate for physical relocation is to underestimate the gravity of the situation. The exile was multifaceted, spiritual, economic, and psychological, and therefore, the return must be equally comprehensive. It involves a restoration of identity that predates re-education and historical revisionism. This appears to be a covenant people awakening from a multi-century induced coma, with global upheaval serving as the alarm. If Black Americans are awakening to an identity rooted in covenant lineage, whether interpreted through Hebrew Israelite frameworks, Afrocentric reclamation, or a general spiritual resurgence within the Black church, then the role of America in this scriptural framework demands scrutiny. It is posited not as the promised land, but as the land of captivity, the entity that enriched itself through specific labor, and the entity slated for judgment prior to liberation. The description of Babylon the Great's fall in Revelation 18 is stark. It is depicted as having become a dwelling place for unclean spirits, an entity with which the kings of the earth committed immorality and by whose luxury the merchants of the earth grew rich. The subsequent instruction in verse 4 is critical. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. The imperative to come out is a prerequisite to avoiding the impending judgment. For many Black Americans who have felt an internal pull over the last half-decade to divest from systems that have historically underserved them, to withdraw assets from major financial institutions, to pursue independent education for their children, to build insular community infrastructure. This is not paranoia. It may well be interpreted as a divine prompt to position oneself before systemic consequences manifest fully. Historical precedent exists for understanding judgment in this context. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher in Virginia, interpreted visions of spiritual conflict and atmospheric signs as indicators that the time of judgment had arrived, leading a rebellion that resulted in significant loss of life and brutal state reprisals. While historians often categorize Turner as an extremist, his own confession reveals he viewed himself as a prophet acting under divine orders, modeling his actions after Moses in Exodus. He believed God was using him to bring judgment upon a nation intoxicated with the blood of the oppressed. While not advocating violence, it is crucial to recognize that Turner's theological premise regarding inevitable judgment on a systemic evil was historically astute. Even if his timing or methods were debated, judgment is rarely executed by a single individual with a weapon. It is more often recognized in systemic collapse, where principalities and powers consume themselves from within. We are witnessing similar systemic failures in real time. The 2008 housing crisis, for example, disproportionately targeted Black wealth through predatory lending practices. Data indicates that over $240 billion in Black home equity evaporated during that period. While the financial institutions responsible were bailed out, families lost everything. This transfers wealth patterns mapped directly onto the affliction described in Exodus. Furthermore, the explosion of mass incarceration, beginning in the 1980s, where a demographic constituting roughly 13% of the general population came to comprise roughly 40% of the prison population, often laboring for negligible wages, creates a modern parallel to biblical descriptions of bondage. The prophetic warnings in Deuteronomy 28, specifically regarding being brought back into a state of bondage via ships, where no buyer would redeem the captive due to supreme devaluation, align with horrifying precision to the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent chattel slavery system where human beings were legally reduced to fractional personhood. The prophecies speak of sons and daughters being given to another people while parents look on helplessly, a dynamic mirrored in the historical auction block, and contemporary critics argue in modern child welfare systems that remove Black children from homes at disproportionately higher rates than white children for similar infractions. However, a complete reading of these texts must go beyond the curses outlined in Deuteronomy 28. The Hebraic literary structure places the climax of judgment immediately before a reversal. Deuteronomy 30 outlines restoration, gathering, and mercy following the period of affliction. If the 1619 to 2019 timeline represents the 400-year count, then the period post-2019 represents the restoration window. The chaotic events witnessed since 2020, global pandemics, social uprisings, economic instability, are interpreted within this framework not as the end of the world, but as the birth pangs of a new order. In this context, figures like Donald Trump are viewed not necessarily as moral saviors or allies of Black liberation, but as Cyrus-like figures, chaotic instruments, used to dismantle the old order to make way for the new. The disruption of established international agreements, federal agencies, and institutional trust during his tenure can be seen as demolition. Preceding Reconstruction, Cyrus was motivated by imperial ambition, yet his actions fulfilled a 70-year prophetic clock. Similarly, political motives today do not nullify potential spiritual ramifications. The instruction for those recognizing this timeline is not passive observation, but active preparation akin to the Hebrews in Egypt prior to the Exodus. It involves strategic disentanglement from the systems of Babylon economically, spiritually, and psychologically. When judgment falls upon a nation, the righteous residing within it are not automatically immune to the fallout of systemic collapse. In 2008, Black families lost an estimated 53% of their collective wealth because they were disproportionately exposed to subprime toxins within the banking system. Staying entangled when the system buckles guarantees impact. The directive to come out requires a deeper understanding of the text. The Hebrew term, often translated as Egypt, Mitzrayim, signifies more than a geographical location. It means a narrow place, a place of constriction and bondage. The prophecy speaks to returning to a state of bondage. The modern manifestations of this bondage have evolved from physical chains to economic and systemic constraints. The crucial element often omitted in conventional teaching is that Deuteronomy 30 is the answer to Deuteronomy 28. The curse has an expiration date. The restoration is the current phase. Historical figures like Harriet Jacobs, who endured 7 years in a cramped attic crawl space to escape enslavement, while simultaneously learning to read and eventually documenting her experiences, serve as models of prophetic witness. Documentation and testimony are vital aspects of preparation, ensuring future generations understand the truth obscured by revisionist histories. The current wave of book bans and curriculum changes regarding American slavery reinforces the necessity of this documentation. Preparation must be active. It involves strategic economic shifts, moving capital from institutions that have historically financed oppression into Black-owned banks, credit unions, or decentralized assets. It involves acquiring land, a historically proven method of surviving systemic collapse. It requires rethinking education through homeschooling or cooperative models that teach financial literacy, critical thinking, and authentic history. It necessitates building robust supply chains within the community through support of Black businesses focused on infrastructure, agriculture, and technology. Spiritually, this moment calls for intense intercession, fasting, and breaking generational curses. This is viewed as an Esther moment, a generation positioned, specifically for a time of crisis and reversal. The opposing forces are also aware of this timeline. The strategy of the enemy is distraction, division, and the maintenance of dependency on collapsing systems. The goal is to ensure that when the prophetic manifestation occurs, the intended recipients are out of position, distracted by entertainment, financially crippled, or spiritually malnourished. If the premise holds true that the 400-year count has ended, and a Cyrus figure is unlocking a prophetic sequence, time is of the essence. The plagues associated with Babylon's fall are described in Revelation 18 as coming rapidly in a single day. This indicates sudden destruction rather than gradual decline. Dependency on Babylon's systems for food, information, and identity when that day arrives spells disaster. Practical coming out, while still physically present in the system, involves building redundancy. This includes creating local food security. Through gardening and connecting with local farmers, securing independent water filtration and energy sources, building alternative information networks, and learning natural health remedies as the medical system strains. Most importantly, it requires building strong, real-world communities that can share resources and provide mutual support when centralized systems fail. This also necessitates a spiritual exodus from institutional churches that mirror Babylon, those prioritizing profit over prophecy, comfort over conviction, and entertainment over discipleship. True repentance, a complete 180-degree turn from the values of Babylon toward the values of the kingdom, is commanded. This internal work involves what Deuteronomy 30 describes as the circumcision of the heart, cutting away the trauma, lies, and generational wounds of oppression. Physical emancipation is insufficient if the mind remains enslaved. The 40-year wandering of the Hebrews was necessitated by their inability to break the slave mentality. Rediscovering one's identity as a royal, priesthood, and a holy nation is paramount to breaking systemic control. The enemy's strategy is to delay this awakening through distraction and trauma. As the restoration window opens further, attacks will intensify, likely through increased internal division, celebrity distractions, and deceptive government programs designed to foster dependency under the guise of aid. Discernment is crucial to avoid compromising one's birthright for temporary relief. The promised restoration includes significant prosperity, not merely for survival but for abundance. Proverbs 13:22 states that the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the righteous. This wealth transfer is strategic, intended for those positioned through obedience, preparation, and faith. The timeline is accelerating. Utilizing the Hebrew calendar, the current era corresponds to a period preceding deliverance. The intensity of current global chaos is interpreted as birth, pangs leading to a breakthrough. Preparation must be spiritual first, then practical. Nehemiah wept, fasted, and prayed before rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. Esther fasted before approaching the king with a strategy. Daniel's consistent prayer life gave him spiritual authority. The impending wealth transfer takes several forms. First, there is the acquisition of distressed assets. For pennies on the dollar, as the old system liquidates during collapse, a pattern observed during the 2008 crisis by those with cash reserves. Second, there is supernatural transfer, echoing the Hebrews plundering the Egyptians through sudden, divinely ordained favor. Third, there is a knowledge transfer as insiders, defect from collapsing systems and share critical expertise in finance, technology, and law with the remnant. Finally, there is the land transfer, a global phenomenon where indigenous and formerly enslaved peoples are demanding and, in some cases, receiving land reparations. This preparation requires patience, endurance, and faith to keep building when results are not yet visible. The intensity of current pressures is a sign of proximity to the breakthrough. Like Caleb and Joshua, the faithful must see the giants but believe in a greater power. It is imperative to understand that this wealth transfer is not for personal luxury but for funding the kingdom agenda, building infrastructure, supporting truth-telling media, and establishing businesses that employ with dignity. The goal is to be blessed in order to be a blessing. For those currently struggling in survival mode, the message is that God calls individuals from the pit, the prison, and the fire. Current difficulties are training grounds for character development. Faithfulness in small things leads to entrustment with much. This season must be used to build character, break cycles, and cultivate discipline. The final charge is specific action. List dependencies on systemic structures and take one step. This month to build redundancy. Identify and decide to break one generational pattern. Establish a non-negotiable daily prayer practice. Build a real-world support tribe. And practice generosity even out of scarcity to break the spirit of poverty. The Cyrus decree is signed. The 400 years are complete. The judgment on Babylon has commenced, and the wealth transfer is in motion. The door is open for the Exodus, with a promised land awaiting on the other side of obedience.